Picture this moment carefully. A single country sitting on one of the largest oil reserves on earth, and suddenly its future is being discussed not in Caracas, but in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. I want you to pause on that, because what's happening with Venezuela right now is not just about oil. It's about power. It's about who gets to decide the rules of the global system and who is forced to follow them. The Trump administration is sending a blunt message. Cut economic ties with China and Russia. Sell your oil only with the United States. Or don't pump at all. Some call this strategic pressure. Others call it reckless. One Democratic senator used a simpler word: boneheaded. And behind that word lies a far bigger question: are we reducing global conflict or quietly setting the stage for the next one? If you want clearer thinking about how power really works in the world today, stay with me. Because to understand this moment, we first need to understand the game being played. Let's define the problem precisely. The administration's position is simple on paper. Venezuela can pump more oil only if it meets two conditions. First, it must sever economic ties with countries considered adversaries of the United States, namely China and Russia. Second, it can only partner with the United States to sell that oil. This is not a suggestion. It is leverage. Republicans largely see this as overdue. From their perspective, China, Russia, and Iran sit at the center of global instability, and keeping them out of the Western Hemisphere is not aggression, it's defense. A modern restatement of the Monroe Doctrine. Democrats see something else. They see a sovereign nation being told who it may trade with. They see oil treated not as the property of the Venezuelan people, but as a bargaining chip in Washington's geopolitical poker game. And they worry about what happens next, because in world politics, pressure rarely exists in isolation. To understand why this matters so much, we need to step back and look at how Venezuela became this strategic fault line in the first place. To understand this moment, you have to understand history not as dates, but as patterns. Venezuela did not drift toward China and Russia by accident. It was pushed there by isolation, sanctions, and a collapsing economy. When Western capital left, Beijing arrived with loans. When diplomatic doors closed, Moscow offered protection. Oil made this possible, not just as a commodity, but as collateral. For years, Venezuela used future oil production to secure survival in the present. China financed infrastructure and debt relief. Russia gained influence and strategic access. And the United States, once Venezuela's dominant partner, watched its leverage erode. This is how power shifts quietly. Not through invasions, but through contracts, credit, and dependency. Now Washington wants to reverse that cycle quickly. By forcing a clean break, by turning oil back into a tool of American influence. But history offers a warning. When great powers try to rewind complex systems all at once, they rarely get the outcome they expect. Because once influence is embedded, removing it is never frictionless. And that brings us to the first real rupture point in this strategy. The first rupture comes from a simple assumption that pressure will stay contained. It won't. According to lawmakers briefed behind closed doors, the message to Venezuela was blunt: cut ties with China and Russia, or the oil stays underground. No gradual transition. No shared framework. Just a line in the sand. Democrats immediately saw the risk because Beijing and Moscow are not passive actors. They have money invested, debts owed, influence built over years. So what happens when that influence is threatened overnight? Retaliation doesn't have to look dramatic. It can be subtle, delayed, targeted elsewhere, a trade decision here, a military signal there, a diplomatic freeze when cooperation is suddenly needed most. This is why one congressman admitted, "I don't know how this is supposed to work out." Not because the goal is unclear, but because the consequences are. If you've ever wondered why global crises seem to cascade instead of staying local, this is how it starts. One demand, one miscalculation, and a system pushed past its tolerance. because once pressure turns public, walking it back becomes politically impossible. And beneath this visible clash lies something far more important, a mechanism most people never see. That's what we need to unpack next. What's hidden beneath this confrontation is not ideology, it's structure. Oil is being treated as leverage, but in reality, it's the lock holding the system together. Venezuela's economy, its debt, its diplomacy, all of it is wired to oil revenue. China and Russia didn't just buy barrels, they embedded themselves into financing, logistics, and political survival. So when Washington demands a clean break, it's not pulling a plug. It's pulling out load-bearing beams. This is where zero-sum thinking becomes dangerous. If Venezuela complies, it risks economic shock and internal instability. If it refuses, it remains isolated and cash-starved. Either way, the system absorbs stress, and great powers respond to stress predictably. They defend sunk costs, they resist humiliation, they look for asymmetry places to push back that are cheaper and less visible. This is why some Democrats warn that this strategy could make it harder, not easier, to create a legitimate Venezuelan government. Pressure without a political off-ramp doesn't reform systems. It hardens them. When geopolitics becomes a contest of forcing choices, every choice creates an enemy. And once that dynamic locks in, escalation doesn't need intention. It happens automatically. Which brings us to the second flashpoint, the moment when global consequences stop being theoretical. The second flashpoint is already visible, even if no one is calling it a crisis yet. Because this strategy doesn't just challenge Venezuela. It challenges China and Russia directly. For Beijing, Venezuelan oil is not only energy, it's repayment. Loans were extended with future barrels in mind. Cutting ties doesn't erase those obligations, it turns them into disputes. For Moscow, the issue is influence. Strategic access in the Western Hemisphere is rare. Losing it under public American pressure is not something Russia absorbs quietly. This is where the tempo accelerates. You don't get a single dramatic response. You get pressure building across multiple fronts. Diplomacy stiffens. Coordination frays. Every unrelated negotiation becomes harder. This is what lawmakers mean when they talk about greater conflict. Not war tomorrow, but a world where cooperation erodes everywhere at once. And here's the paradox. The tougher the demand, the narrower the path forward. Backing down looks weak. Doubling down raises the stakes. At that point, the policy no longer belongs to the architects. It belongs to the momentum it created, and momentum in geopolitics rarely stops where anyone intends. But the most overlooked consequences aren't in Washington, Beijing, or Moscow. They're closer to home. Now, let's shift the lens away from capitals and committees and toward you, the ordinary Venezuelan citizen caught inside this pressure. Because when governments play leverage games, it's never abstract on the ground. If oil stays locked, wages don't rise. Hospitals don't restock. Electricity stays unreliable. Food prices don't stabilize. And if oil flows under strict conditions, the question becomes who controls the benefit. You don't live inside doctrines or strategies. You live inside consequences. When oil becomes a bargaining chip between superpowers, your daily life becomes collateral. This is why some lawmakers warn that treating Venezuelan oil as if it belongs to Washington is not just offensive, it's destabilizing. Because legitimacy doesn't come from pressure. It comes from people believing their future is theirs to shape. If you've ever felt powerless watching global politics unfold, this is why. Decisions made thousands of miles away quietly rewrite lives at home. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When people are squeezed from all sides, stability doesn't increase. It fractures. If you want analysis that keeps human reality at the center, not just flags and power, stay with me. Because what happens next won't stop at Venezuela's borders. Once pressure fractures a society, The shockwaves never stay local. Venezuela sits in a region the United States has long considered strategically quiet. But that quiet has always depended on balance, not dominance. If China and Russia are forced out abruptly, they don't disappear. They reallocate. They look for influence elsewhere in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. They harden positions in places where cooperation with Washington once came easily. This is how a regional policy becomes a global one. Energy markets tighten. Diplomatic trust erodes. Every multilateral forum becomes more transactional, more suspicious. And allies start asking uncomfortable questions. If Venezuela can be told who it may trade with, who's next? What happens when pressure becomes precedent? This is why some Democrats warn against turning the world into a permanent zero-sum contest. Not because competition is avoidable, but because constant confrontation multiplies risk. Global systems don't break from one dramatic move. They break from accumulated strain, and when strain spreads across energy, diplomacy, and security at the same time, even small shocks can trigger outsized reactions. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. Where does this road actually lead? There are three paths forward from here. None of them are clean. The first is the optimistic scenario. Pressure works. Venezuela gradually rebalances. China and Russia reduce their footprint without dramatic retaliation. Oil revenue stabilizes, and a more legitimate government slowly takes shape. This outcome requires restraint, coordination, and something rare in geopolitics, patience. The second path is managed friction. Venezuela partially complies. China and Russia push back indirectly. Tensions rise, but remain contained. The world grows colder, more transactional, but not explosive. This is the most likely scenario, uncomfortable, costly, and unstable by design. The third path is the dangerous one. A clean break is forced. Beijing and Moscow respond elsewhere. Energy markets react. Diplomatic crises multiply. What began as leverage over oil becomes a test of wills across the global system. History suggests systems under stress don't fail all at once. They fail when leaders mistake pressure for control. And the future will hinge on a single question. Is this strategy shaping behavior or simply accelerating confrontation? Because once the world is framed as win or lose everywhere, there are no small decisions anymore. Only consequences, which brings us to the final insight. Here is the insight worth holding on to. Power in the modern world is not about forcing choices. It's about shaping systems so fewer choices become necessary. The Venezuela strategy reveals a deeper truth about this moment in history. We are drifting toward a world where every relationship is treated as leverage and every compromise as weakness. That is not strength. It is fragility disguised as confidence. Yes, the United States has every reason to limit Chinese and Russian influence, but how it does so will define the next decade of global politics. Pressure without legitimacy doesn't build order. It erodes it. If you've watched global tensions rise and wondered why they feel harder to contain, this is part of the answer. We are playing more zero-sum games in more places at the same time. And those games don't end cleanly. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, share it. These conversations matter more than headlines. And if you want to understand what comes next, not just in Venezuela, but in the global contest for power, stay with me. Because the story isn't ending here.